Good morning. This is Jason Dean from Film Fanatic coming at you again with a live show here from Film Fanatic headquarters. Hope everyone's doing good. It's about 10:12 Friday morning, start of a long weekend, more or less a 4-day weekend. Today I have off, and most people have Monday off because it's Martin Luther King Day, so it's a great holiday. So it's funny. It's always funny having a after we had, because I've been working in the school districts for quite a few years now, or working within the school district, and it's always funny when we have all these breaks and stuff because we're just coming out of Christmas break and the start of 2023. So here we are again with another little break, but it's pretty cool. It's amazing how quickly time goes by. That is for sure. So yeah, before we get into this next movie that I've been really excited about, and this is like, I don't know, kind of tied together with the movie I put up yesterday. I did a show on Night of the Bloody Apes, which is a Mexican horror exploitation movie that came out in 1969, and I put up a video yesterday about that movie. And the package that I got when I bought this movie came with another movie by one of the same directors. And there's a whole like interesting story with that I'm eager to get into, and also this other movie, which is actually, in a weird way, I think it's like a prequel to Night of the Bloody Apes, which I didn't realize until last night. Really strange. So yeah, before we get into that, just wanted to let everybody know again. I want to, I really appreciate people checking out this page. It's been growing every day, every few weeks, and it's been awesome because again, I always I say it more and more with each show that I love bringing to light, for what it is. Some of these incredibly obscure movies that are pretty underground. And again, if you're a fan of horror or science fiction, particularly in the exploitation world, but if you're a fan of classic horror films, it's always great to kind of trace things back to see maybe the big picture of things, to see where some of these things kind of originated and what maybe other directors that predated directors that you're aware of were doing, or what other, say in the world of horror, what other regions, or particularly what other countries were also doing horror films and like exploitation films. And it's super interesting. But first and foremost, we have, if you're around in the beautiful town of Union, Maine. Union's about 35 minutes or so from my house, pretty close by. We are playing a quantum show tonight at 5:30 with my great friend Tom Luther, and it's a 5:30 start time. It's at the Poor Farm in Warren. Very cool place, or I should say Union, Maine, and it's a super cool place. It's a brew pub. It's a nano brewery. It's it's kind of like a little paradise, that place. I discovered that place probably about 3 years ago. A friend of mine who is a local rock star, Ryan Moody, who has gotten a lot of followers and traction the last few years because he's been running lots of open mics. Super cool guy, one of the nicest people you ever meet, and he's pretty talented. And it's really interesting because I met Ryan about probably 5 or 6 years ago. I was I have some experience also running open mics. I used to run, well, way back when I there used to be a place in Camden, a little restaurant. Geez, I can't even remember the name of it. Smokestack, I think maybe that's what it was called. And it was a place I used to go to. I used to work right above the hill from this place, and this was in Camden, Maine. When I worked at the teen center, there was a place called I believe that's what the name was because it's been so long. But there was a bar kind of at the bottom of the street called the Smokestack, and got in a habit with at that time when I was working at the teen center, there was we had 5 or 6 people on staff all the time. We got to become pretty good friends, and we got in a routine of going to the Smokestack after work and having a few drinks, a few beers, and we used to meet at least like once a week down there, and then we ended up becoming really really close friends after that. But it was a really cool time, and we used to go down and just kind of hang out. And at that time, I was playing in a couple of little projects, a couple of bands, and we started. I was playing with Vince Gabriel, also another local legend, especially Vince, who plays. He's been playing music forever. He's kind of a local icon. And we had played on and off again for a long time, but we started this thing where we were playing at this place every Sunday, the Smokestack, and we were doing like a reggae kind of gig. It was kind of a strange thing, but we started doing a regular Sunday 3 hour like reggae gig where we were playing as a trio, and we would do just about 3 hours of like more or less reggae music, and we would mix it up, play some blues and some rock and roll. But it was mostly on that, and it was like a reggae brunch. It was kind of a weird gig because it was on a Sunday, and it was okay. It was always fairly mellow, but it was a cool gig, and we got paid real well, and it was a cool thing to do locally to stay active with gigs. And we had it for probably about 5 or 6 months, and right at that time that we had started that gig, I had talked to the owners and knew a couple of those folks who ran that place at the time. They used to own a restaurant called Ingraham's, which was a really beautiful restaurant that unfortunately had closed, but they reopened to this other place that was a little bit more of I guess, a family style kind of restaurant. And it was still really cool, and I had a pretty good rapport with them, so we started this Sunday jazz or Sunday reggae kind of thing, and it was every week. And then after that was going, we ended up talking about doing more things, and I started running an open mic. It was the first time I'd ever done it, and I haven't really done it since then. But at that time, I had this kind of crazy idea. I was friends with one of the guys there, this guy Alex, who was the chef. I got to know him pretty well, and he was a bass player. Super cool guy, and I see him every now and then, and we always talk about that time. But we had this idea of maybe running an open mic, so I talked to everybody, and we ended up doing an open mic every Thursday there, and it was really disorganized. It was kind of a circus. I didn't really know what I was doing, especially the first few times that I started running this open mic. I had no experience, so there was no like, kind of like sign up sheet or what. There was no formal thing as far as people showing up and when to play and whatnot. We just basically set up drums. I brought my a little drum set. We had a PA system and a couple little amps, and we'd advertise it a little bit, and then whoever would show up, we would just all play. And it was never, you know, really organized as far as how long people will play, but we got everybody up there to play, and over a period of time, it got a little bit more organized where everybody had more time to play. But it was a little bit of a chaotic kind of situation compared to how most open mics are run, where you have a sign up sheet. There's a set time that everybody's going to play, and it's pretty organized. We didn't really do that. It was just like we set up some instruments and just kind of had a free for all. And it was cool, for a while. But at that time, I used to go to the co-op in Belfast, and there was a guy by the name of Tom Luther who was a really cool guy. We used to talk about music all the time. And he had said that, yeah, I'm a piano player and I play music a lot. I'm really into Miles Davis and Wayne Shorter and Charles Mingus, and we talk a lot about music, and he was always like super cool and hilarious, and we always had kind of the same sense of humor. And we started talking about uh, you know music, and and he had these aspirations to uh, try to start his own band, his own group. He had experience, playing in different groups and stuff, but not so much here in Maine. And I never got a chance to hear him play piano. And I had told him after a few months of us, and I used to run into him all the time in the store. After a few months, I said to him, you should come down to this jam that I'm doing on Thursday nights at the smokestack. It's pretty loose and informal, but there'll be plenty of time for you to play, and we can kind of play whatever you want to play. And he had said, "Oh yeah, I have all of this music that I've been writing and so forth." So he he ended up coming down, and my great friend Mike Whitehead, who plays bass in Quantum, he came down. And at that time, he was not playing bass; he was playing only trumpet. Trumpet is his main instrument. And when I told Tom about coming down, also told Mike, and I was like, "You should meet this guy, Tom Luther. He's a really cool guy, super funny, hilarious, and he's got all these. It sounds like he's got all this music stuff going on." And I didn't know that he was, a pretty, I didn't know he was a musician and that he seemed so serious about it. So I had mentioned it to Mike, and Mike came down that same night and brought his trumpet, and then Tom came and brought his keyboard, and we that was the first time we all kind of played together, and it was the first time I heard Tom play piano, and I was just blown away by it. And after that, kind of the rest is history. Tom went on to start his own groups. He had two or three different jazz groups for a while. There was about maybe a 2 year period where I actually, or maybe a little less, I was playing drums with him in one of his groups. And again, it was all like original based music. He did some standards, but he would do all of his own kind of arrangements. And I was just blown away by how much music he had going on and how much was in his brain. And then eventually he started this other group called Algorithm, which was an electronic group, and it was really awesome. And I really was a big fan. And then at that time, that was right around the time I had started Quantum. So that was our first time doing that kind of thing together, which is similar to what we're doing tonight, where we did a show. An Algorithm was an electronic group that he had for quite a few years, and they put out a couple of albums, and they used to play quite a bit in the area for a while. And we ended up doing a show at this art gallery in Belfast that's long gone now, but it was a super great space because they would have a lot of interesting music there, and not stuff you would see at bars. And Algorithm was playing gigs there at the time, and they were getting good crowds there. So we ended up doing a show. It was probably the first year that we started Quantum, and Mike was also playing an Algorithm during that time. He was playing bass in that band and playing some trumpet. So we did a show together at Aarhus Gallery, and it was a really great time. And after that, Tom started even progressing more into electronic music to where he's at, to where he's now, to where he is now, and he's also gotten way into becoming a full-time teacher. So Tom's one of the most inspiring people I know, and he's one of the greatest people around, one of the most talented. And about a year or two ago, he started this new electronic project called Sphere Music. So it's it's just incredible music. I got to see Sphere Music play actually at the Poor Farm the summer before last, and it was I think might have been one of his first shows with that group, and it was this real atmospheric, cinematic kind of electronic soundscape kind of a thing. And I was totally digging. It was totally awesome. And after that, we were like, we should like maybe play some shows together. And at that time, that year, that's when obviously the pandemic and everything changed, everything shut down. So we didn't play as Quantum for a very long time. And then when things started to kind of open up again, Tom had this idea of putting together this 2 day music festival that like kind of showcased electronic music and also music that was, kind of on the fringe side. So he asked us to play, and we did a Quantum set at this festival, and it was at the Poor Farm, and it was our first time playing at the Poor Farm, and it was a lot of fun, and it was great. And then we also played a show this past summer together with Sphere Music and with Quantum, and it was a really great time. So it's been a nice it's been a wonderful journey with how each thing has kind of progressed and how we've been fortunate enough to really work together. So tonight we're doing another show together, and it's at 5:30. It's at the Poor Farm in Union. It's a wonderful place, uh, and it's going to be Quantum and Sphere Music, and it starts at 5:30. And so if you're around, please come by and check it out. And when I started off the show, I was talking about Ryan Moody, who Ryan Moody is like again, he's really well known as a because he's run a lot of open mics, and he's really built a little bit of a nice name for himself, and he's a super cool guy. He's got a great reputation with being really professional. And I met Ryan uh, about 5 years ago. I got back into helping out running open mics, but I was playing drums in this house band at Fog, and Vince Gabriel was running it at the time, and I did that for quite a few years. But Ryan used to come to it, and at that time he had never really. Um, he was very new to music. He had just started playing, and we used to sit in. He used to sit in with us, and we'd play, and then he'd come back every week. And over a period of a couple of years, he really, put a lot of work into his craft and got to be a pretty competent musician. And he's really like, just really matured as a musician. And now he's like, he plays gigs and he runs these open mics, and he's a local, kind of a local legend. And I saw him last night for this other open mic that he took over for a friend that was sick, and it's very cool. So it's always great. I always love seeing how these things happen. We live in this small town, but there's like this cool like thing where people at various levels can get into the scene, this this little music scene at least that we have, and kind of cultivate, and it can be a real cultivating experience, and things can grow. So yeah, it's really great. It's a really great little community as far as putting your time in, and if you have an interest trying to develop as an artist and a musician. And that's exactly how, and really the only way, as far as you know how it's related to Quantum. That's really the only way we've been able to kind of develop, even on a small scale, to where we can, you know to where the band's evolved to where it's a regular band, and it's a regular, it's a thing that's like living and breathing, where we've put out albums and stuff. So yeah, it's very cool. So today's show is kind of a sequel or a prequel to the show I did yesterday. And I didn't realize it. It's funny because I watched yesterday I did a show on this movie, Night of the Bloody Apes. This came out in 1969. And this movie is pretty gonzo. It's pretty nuts. I finished it up last night. Uh, I'd seen this one or two other times before, and I watched it again the other night. And then I finished it last night. And I did a show, I put up a video about this movie. And this is like a Mexican, It's from Mexico, and it's a like a Mexican horror exploitation movie, and it's totally crazy. And it's amazing. The thing I'm blown away by it, that I was so blown away by watching this film again, was just the how violent this movie is. It's ultra low budget. It's like it's very it's super gritty. It's a pure, it's the definition through and through of what an exploitation movie is. But it's also got this real pulpy vibe to it. It's just, and it's so entertaining, and it's really bizarre. It's a very bizarre movie, and it's kind of a weird knockoff of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. You have a character who is like Dr. Frankenstein. You have a character who is his assistant in this laboratory that's modeled off of Frankenstein's assistant Igor. He's like this mad scientist. His son is dying, so he's doing all of these various experiments to try to save his son and keep his son alive or bring his son back from the dead. And in this movie, or in that movie, Night of the Bloody Apes, he's doing all of these animal experiments, and he creates this. He brings his son back to life through the use of transplanting an ape's heart into his own body. But during that process, he ends up becoming this weird creature, this hybrid of where he's half man and half ape. But he only has his pure animal instincts, and he's like kind of this monster. And he just goes on this rampage where he's like killing people and there's like all this craziness. But it's considering that this movie was made in 1969. Watching it last night, I was just like, holy mackerel! Like, it's super violent. There's like scenes of where someone gets their throat ripped open. There's heads being ripped off. There's a rape scene that's really graphic, and there's blood splurring everywhere. Eyeballs popping out of their skulls. Flesh. Somebody having their top of their head ripped off. I mean, and you look at it, for face value, it's super comical and it's super cheesy because this movie was done on such a minuscule budget. But when you actually look at it, like I said, if you look at it at face value, it's like it's so brutal. It's so brutal and it's so gory. And when you think that this was made in 1969, it's like it's crazy. Like I talk about that a lot where my first few my first movie I remember pretty much seeing that I considered to be, kind of more or less my introduction to like the slasher genre. And it's probably the same experience for most kids at that time was the Friday the 13th franchise, particularly the first two or three, and those were movies that were always regular part of my youth. And that was my introduction to slasher movies. And slasher movies, slasher exploitation horror movies, those are, again, I love all kinds of movies, but those are my favorite. I love, for me, there's nothing better than sitting down and watching a really great classic slasher movie, particularly something from late 70s to the early 80s. Like, to me, that's my jam. Like, I just enjoy it so much. It's always interesting too. I don't even really care if it's necessarily a movie because the slasher genre is kind of a genre specific style, I guess if you want to call it, where there's definitely you have those tropes of where there's always going to be a group of teenagers or young people that are in this remote area, and then there's always going to be this character who is wearing a mask or carrying an axe or both or a knife, and he systematically one by one kills each one, kills each character off. And there's usually scenes of where there's like lots of violence and gore and blood, and then that's always tied in with the sex element. There's usually always like all kinds of sex and violence kind of all thrown in together. But it's usually that scene of like where they're, that general thing of where they're picked off one by one. So there's like a very like genre wise, There's a very like specific formula to kind of what a slasher film is, and there's a level of suspense, and then also if the film has a really kind of creepy atmosphere where it's like set in a, a lot of slasher films are set in pretty isolated areas, like say in the woods or in a cabin somewhere or in this big dark house, or there's always this sense of isolation where these group of teenagers or young people go to this place of where they don't know anything about it. It's kind of this mysterious, foreboding environment. Um, their camps are used a lot. There's, obviously Friday 13th, set Camp Crystal Lake, or Sleepaway Camp, another classic slasher film, another camp. There's always, and then another, probably my all-time favorite movie, which is a little bit of a different thing because it's more of a serious movie, whereas the Friday 13th films are pretty light. But Maniac from Bill Luswig, that's centered around the serial killer, and that takes place in New York. But there's even that sense of environment. So there's always that kind of thing. And so my first exposure to like gore and violence in the horror genre was Friday 13th. So, and then when I discover, years later, I've been taking those deep dives, and at that time, watching Friday 13th, I still think it's still a violent movie, and I almost think it's probably the most violent movie in the whole series in a lot of ways. And that came out in 1980, and to think that, and then when I discover this movie, Night of the Bloody Apes, which came out in 1969, which is completely insane how much earlier this film is, say, to Friday the 13th, and just how incredibly violent it is, and to see that wow, like there were these filmmakers making this. But this package is really awesome, and the thing that's so interesting is that there's two movies on here, and I started watching the other film, Doctor of Doom, last night, and I've seen that before too, and that's also it's also directed by the same director, one of the same directors of Night of the Bloody Apes. Night of the Bloody Apes was basically created by these two Mexican directors, these two exploitation directors, and this was solely directed by one of those guys, Rene Cordona, and he directed Doctor of Doom, and I didn't realize the date of this film, but this came out in '63, so this predated this came out before Night of the Bloody Apes. And I started watching this movie again last night, and I pretty much finished it. And it's super bizarre. It's crazy because the central character of Night of the Bloody Apes is this kid who becomes this, due to the father who is this Dr. Frankenstein character, and he tries to save his life. His son is dying from this heart condition, and so he does this experimental operation of where he transplants this heart of this ape into his son, and then his son becomes this weird hybrid of an ape slash man, but he is like completely psychotic, and he's like this monster, and he goes on this rampage, but it's like a total knockoff and ripoff of Frankenstein. The interesting thing too about watching this movie, Doctor Doctor of Doom, is it's still the same character, like that character of the son who becomes this weird ape, hybrid monster who goes on this rampage, is also in Doctor Doom. And this came out before, and it's interesting, so it's like literally the same character in both movies. Doctor of Doom is a little bit less of a gore movie. It's a little bit less violent, but it's super weird. It's a super strange. I think in some ways, uh, it's almost a more bizarre movie because there's a few characters in this film that are these that, and it takes place in Mexico, and it's an all Mexican cast, and there's a lot of scenes, and there's like three or four characters of these female characters that are these professional Mexican wrestlers. So there's all these scenes of these wrestling matches, and it's super hilarious and super so so over the top and so entertaining. And the other thing about this film is it's all black and white. It's all shot in black and white, so it looks like gorgeous. But the wrestling scenes are just so over the top and so ridiculous. But it also is something to be said about like the kind of the choreography is pretty awesome and pretty amazing. And there's also a scene of where these women are being attacked by this group of these goons, and they break into their house. These women kind of all live together in this apartment, and they're like these Mexican professional wrestlers. And there's this scene where these goons, these kind of hitmen, go there to kind of kill them and to kidnap them, and they fight them off, and they basically kick all of their asses, and it's like super hilarious. They like throw the guys out of the window and beat them up, and it's great. It's like the action sequences are amazing, and and the story is pretty wild. It's pretty strange. It's a little bit it's this film is a little bit more compared to Night of the Bloody Apes. It's way more on the sillier side. It's a little bit more lighthearted. It's not as violent, but it's very. I think it's a stranger film because the doctors in this film that have this creature that have created this creature uh, are it's like a group of doctors, and it's like a team of doctors, and they have this like underground kind of bunker that they've created. And what they're trying to do is also they're trying to create another like to a degree another race that they're through their experiments where they're trying to create more of these weird hybrid ape creatures. And there's a scene of where they're trying to they're seeking a female to make a mate for this creature, and it's super bizarre. It's super weird. And there's all these scenes where the doctors kind of and they're also there's so there's like a group of them, but they have these hitmen or henchmen that work for them, and they're going out to try to kidnap and to kill and basically well mostly centered on kidnapping these women to do these experiments on them to try to create like a female counterpart or a mate for their creature that they created. And they always whenever they're on screen they wear these like white hoods and they have these white masks, and it's really weird and super bizarre. And then the creature itself, he also there's scenes of where they drive him around, and he's like also with them to try to end along with the henchmen to try to capture these women. And he's wearing this like kind of body armor suit with this like steel mask, and it's super bizarre. It's so weird, and that's tied in with the whole like wrestling, the whole Mexican wrestling thing, and it's super bizarre. And it's like it's wild. But it's super wacky, and the whole getup that the ape creature has really reminds me of Iron Man. He looks like Iron Man because he's got this like metal suit, and he's got this metal mask, and when he's in public, he's like wearing this suit for some reason. And he's a little bit more, and his character in this movie, Doctor Doom, is a little bit more. He seems like he's under control by these doctors. He's not running rampant like he is in Night of the Bloody Apes. He's not just, going on this rampage. These doctors have like total control of him. He's still got those instincts, but he like completely follows them and is under he is under the doctor's command. So you don't see him going on these rampages, but he'll in a controlled environment he's still that very much that same kind of animal. And it's a different actor playing this monster, and he's more reserved, but he's still the same character. And I just thought it was really wild that like this movie, or if you're looking at it from the a chronological order, Night of the Bloody Apes is actually kind of like the sequel to a degree. even though the films are both very, very different, it's like the same, two different movies, but you have the same. The main character of both of these films is the monster, this ape man, and he's the same character in both movies, but yet around it and the narrative is very, very different, especially Doctor Doom, and they're related, but then they're not, and it's wild. It's a totally weird uh, string of movies. But I kind of felt like after watching Doctor Doom, that might have been cool to actually start with that one first. And also that this movie came out in '63 is just bananas, like literally, no pun intended, or pun intended. It's wild to see that this Gonzo movie was made in '63, and there's a really great special features bonus documentary that comes with this disc. And there's a couple of interviews with these guys that are like Mexican exploitation film specialists, evidently. And they have the two guys. The one guy who does this, who's interviewed, he there's a documentary where it's basically a long interview, but he talks about the whole history of the world of Mexican horror exploitation, which again I just like discovered, didn't even know it was a thing until a year ago, and and it's centered on these two directors, and it's wild. Like it's this whole other world of where I never knew or thought it had ever existed, and it goes pretty. He talks extensively about Rene Cordona and both of these guys being such popular directors in Mexico during the '60s that were making these totally bizarre movies, and super wild. It's like, again, like I've said before, where you take a little bit of a deep dive into the world of horror exploitation, and then you discover these other directors and these this whole other uh, scene that was happening that predated what you thought was where it started, and you discover that, well, wow, that crazy, this is crazy, like this thing was going on in Mexico in the '60s. Just wild. and and Rene Cordona, who also directed the movie from yesterday, made a whole bunch of movies during that time. The Batwoman, which came out in 1968, Night of the Bloody Apes here, Santo and Dracula's. There's another series of films where he kind of did the same thing. There's this character, Santo, that he created, and there's one film called Santo Against the Strangler, and he made a whole series of movies that were a whole series. He made a whole series of movies that were based around this character, Santo. Just totally bizarre. And these films were all made in the mid to late '60s. Santo and Dracula's Treasure. Uh, just fascinating. He also did a version called. Actually, this is even older, which is wild. Which I These are the only two films I've seen of in his whole like discography. But he made a ton of movies. He also made a movie in 1959 called Santa Claus vs. the Devil. So bizarre. Like, I can't wait to see something like that. He also made a movie in the '70s called Survive. Um, just wild. And that's one of the things that I love so much about doing this channel and just taking these deep dives, in the world of exploitation, because it's like this is a prime example. Like, this totally obscure Mexican director who I had no idea who the heck he was, until recently, and then you check out, one or two of his films, and you're like, this is pretty wild. Like, I dig this stuff, and then you look him up, and you're like, holy mackerel! Like, he's got all these other movies, and like, apparently he was a real, kind of mover and shaker during that time. It's wild. Uh, he made another film also based on that same character, Santos versus the Riders of Terror, uh, Wrestling Woman, which came out in 1964. Just wild. So again, like I've said before, like that for me, being a fan of, especially being a fan of the world of horror exploitation and in general exploitation movies, taking a little bit of that deep dive, suddenly it's like, holy mackerel, who is this guy? And then I discover all of these other films. So what ends up happening a lot when I discover a film or a director that is, maybe related to a film that I really love, I'll usually keep, like, like for instance, or for example, like the next time I go to a Bull Moose to do some shopping for some movies, I'll like think of his name, or maybe I'll write a note and be like, okay, I'm going to look for anything that he's got. So it causes this ripple effect, and then I can check out. It will like expose me to all of these other films, by this director who I just discovered, and I see one of his films, and I'm like, wow, like this is mind blowing. But then you look him up, and he's like, there's tons of other films. That happened fairly recently for me with Jess Franco, who is like one of my favorite Spanish directors, and one of the greatest like exploitation directors, and probably from overall probably the most prolific director that I know of, like just in general. And it was one of those cases. I saw a handful of his movies when I was a kid during the VHS days. He made a series of these exploitation movies and a series of these horror films. Had seen them as a kid, but didn't know anything about Jess Franco as a director. Fast forward 1,000 years, and then I got really into collecting movies, and I bought a couple of his movies on a whim, and I was like, oh wait, I did see this as a kid. Then I look him up, do some research, and then I realize, wow, he's got like over 100 movies. And then I start seeking out his stuff. So it's awesome. It's a super fun time. So definitely check out this package. It's pretty amazing. Night of the Bloody Apes and Doctor of Doom, two fantastic exploitation movies, both from the early 60s, 69 and 63. So this stuff is on the way back, and two incredibly bizarre movies, and the biggest thing being the excessive gore is wild. It's wild and crazy to me, because I think about when these films came out in the 60s, predating by many years any of the films in the Friday 13th. So, but this is Jason Dean. So if you and enjoy these weird movies that I like to cover, please like and subscribe. I really appreciate the love, and we will see you next time. Peace.